What is up, everybody? I'm NoLucksGiven here with your afternoon snap, and today we're going to talk about a bunch of the top deck lists from the Golden Gauntlet 2. We're going to take a look at most of the top 16 lists, plus a few others that I thought looked interesting, and we're going to kick that off with the first place deck here from Roram. This is a 34 card Agamotto Thanos RSM deck, and actually, in order to contextualize this, there's one other thing that I want to talk about. First, if we take a look at one of the top 8 decks from Rabbit Suite, we see Ronan the Accuser and, importantly, Supergiant. And that is what I wanted to talk about here. First, Supergiant had 0 copies in the first Golden Gauntlet, and now it has made the top 8 with 2 more power in the most recent OTA, and I think that really illustrates how close the power level of every card is in Marvel Snap. To take a card that was considered by the competitive scene at large to be basically unplayable and get it into the top 8 with 2 more power added on really means that everything is actually a pretty good Marvel Snap card. I think that the devs do a great job of balancing across the board, and if you added an additional power or made anything a little bit cheaper, it could potentially become one of the best cards in the game. And I'm not quite saying Supergiant is at that level, but that's really relevant with RSM specifically, because RSM has to play with all of these random game pieces. And sure, things like, let's see, I'm just scrolling through the collection here, White Tiger or Rescue. These are not the most powerful cards in the game. For sure, they don't really see any play at all. However, if you're able to play those cards one turn earlier, and I know I'm not saying anything super crazy here, RSM's pretty good, but I just want to illustrate why it is so good, because you can basically get a 4-cost White Tiger, a White Tiger that you're allowed to play on turn 4, a Rescue that you're allowed to play on turn 3. And sure, those aren't cards that are like super crazy in a vacuum, but when you have them with a little bit of a discount, then they actually do wind up doing a lot of work for you. The rest of this RSM list is fairly straightforward, though I will talk a little bit in a moment on the rise of this 34 card strategy that seems to be popping up as the most popular home for RSM decks. But outside of that, we just have a bunch of tech, and I guess I will actually talk about Surge too, because there's going to be a lot of Surge in a lot of these decks that we're going to look at. Surge does the same thing that I just said. If you had a 4/2 White Tiger, that's probably the best card in the game. If you took any card in Marvel Snap and made it cost 1 less and have 1 more power, then I think it's probably just going to have a more efficient rate than any of the other cards that don't have that treatment applied. Surge also works very well on the RSM curve, of course, because you want to have something to do with 2 energy on turn 2, and then immediately go up to 4 energy on that next turn. So we see Galacta really here as the only card that is really taking advantage of that, with Shang-Chi and Enchantress more being plays for later on in the game. But I think Legion is a great example of exactly what I was talking about with RSM. Legion is a card that really does not see that much play outside of RSM decks. It does see some play occasionally in some Thanos decks, and also in some Corvus Hela decks. So it's not an unplayable card, but it is in every single RSM deck because it is actually a pretty reasonable card, but it is absolutely incredible when you can play it on turn 4. There's a number of locations that have synergies on turn 4 and allow you to do some other things with it, like it can turn off TVA in RSM, which it wouldn't be able to do otherwise. But yeah, I'm not really breaking any new ground here to be talking about why I love RSM, but I'm a huge RSM defender, and it is cool to see a little bit of a rise in popularity for RSM again. Thanos in RSM is certainly a little bit interesting, but it does allow you to spend your curve in those early 2 turns on reasonable things in the form of the stones, and we've just seen the fact that Thanos is a reasonable card recently across the board. The main reason that Thanos is giving you that value too is just existing as a big card in your hand, meaning that this deck doesn't play Isan, it doesn't play Blob, it doesn't need to play anything else at the top of the curve because you always start the game with a Thanos in your hand. So that is definitely something worth noting, and then it can fill out your curve with that extra energy from Arishem. You have more flexibility in terms of how you can weave those stones out on the later turns of the game as well. Agamotto is an interesting one to me because Agamotto initially does not seem like that powerful of a Marvel Snap card to me. However, it also does significantly raise the curve of your deck for only an inclusion of 1 card. That's because Agamotto is a 5-cost card, but Temporal Manipulation drawing the Agamotto does kind of mean you have 2 5-cost cards in your deck for just 1 deck slot, which I also think is pretty powerful. And then Winds and Bolts, these are reasonably powerful cards as well, with Images being another card that really raises the curve, gives you a payoff for those stones, and just gives you something to do with other random junk that you might get from Arishem. So that is how Images and Agamotto kind of ties the whole deck together here. And this is the current most popular version of Arishem really recently, is this 34 card. And I always just call it in my collection, I always just name it Deck 34, like it's an auto-generated deck. And yeah, this is currently the most popular build of Arishem, and I don't think we're going to take a look at too much other Arishem throughout this video. I'm sure I have one other Arishem deck to look at, but for the most part, 34 card Arishem is what people were playing. I did showcase, I think, another Arishem deck yesterday, but I'm not going to cover any of the decks from the top 16 that I also looked at yesterday. But I do have a few other bonus decks, like I said, but I do also want to look at this second place deck list here, which kind of looks like Arishem less Arishem in a lot of ways. This deck is making use of the new Merlin as well, but also Loki, which we typically see as an Arishem card, but in this deck is just like, okay, if the metagame is a bunch of Thanos and Arishem, just people playing a bunch of really good cards, I'm going to change my deck into their deck, and like I said, any card in Marvel Snap with -1 cost all of a sudden becomes the best card in the game. So if you can spend a Loki to make your entire deck not only just random cards with -1 cost, but the cards that your opponent selected as being good Marvel Snap cards, making them all cost 1 less, well then that makes a lot of sense. And then we also see this combo right here of both Zabu and Surge, both kind of aiming to do the same thing, which is allowing you to play a Galacta, which is still a really busted card on turn 3. Galacta, just like by the numbers here, this is kind of a messed up card. It is a 4/11 if you just play it on turn 4 and then get 2 uses out of it, but it's also so much more than that so often. And all of the decks that are playing it, either Arishem, I won't say all, but a lot of the decks that are playing it, either Arishem or with Zabu and Surge, have the opportunity to get out Galacta on turn 3, and then all of a sudden, well, it's a 3/14, which is obviously ridiculous and a lot of power. So that is a lot of what this deck is going for, just aiming. And then Gwenpool is a 4/12, also a ridiculous rate, at a 3/12, insane. Trying to get all of those out, and then just playing like some reasonable tech across the board with Shang-Chi Enchantress, both cheapened by the Zabu as well, and then Killmonger making it into the finals against what they expected would be a field full of Galactus. And I will say, in the top 4, they did defeat ongoing Thanos to get into the finals, and this is a Thanos deck that really heavily relies on the power of those stones to pump them up with Spectrum and Blue Marvel, use the stones to pump up Thanos, of course, but then also the stones pump up your Ant-Man, Goliath, and Dazzler. So I'm sure they were able to use Killmonger to good effect throughout the entire tournament, but also specifically in those semifinals. And then we see a little bit of a Fenris Wolf package rounding out the deck with both Gladiator and Shang-Chi to clean it up. But against an Arishem Thanos deck that doesn't really rely on the stones, that just has them there, the Killmonger wasn't able to do enough work, and the Loki wasn't able to come up big enough to replace their deck with a bunch of Arishem cards. The Arishem deck just did that better and didn't even have to draw Loki to do it, just had that +1 extra energy on turn 3 of each game. The final deck in the top 4 was this one from Honifer, which honestly, I don't think that I gave this deck enough of its flowers yesterday. So this is a sort of clog deck with Annihilus, Sentry, the Hood, Viper, and then also the Acid Arrow from Hawkeye Kate Bishop, and Yellow Jacket being able to give the Void and the Hood -1 power additionally. But importantly, all of those cards are on reveal cards, and Werewolf by Night can take advantage of all of them, but also Werewolf by Night is a pretty cool combo with Merlin because all of Merlin's skills or spells are on reveal. And that just gives you a 1 cost on reveal that you can play each turn. You get the effect of the skill, which are all pretty good rate, 1, 2, 1, kind of tough to value. I mean, if you're putting this on like the Sentries, the Void, it could be like, I don't know, it could be like 14 power worth of power for 1 energy, and then also moving the Werewolf on top of all of these. And then, yeah, this one is also +2 power. The other one is +2 energy. I might have misspoke on that one. But back to this deck list here in full. One thing that is also really interesting about Annihilus strategies, when your opponent sees you filling up a location with the Void and the Hood, they have 2 options, and this is really interesting how you can get into the mind games with this, because in order to play around getting those cards from Viper or Annihilus, you can fill up the rightmost location so that those cards can't go into your location. And if your opponent is banking on winning that location by just having those negative powers come over to you, then you kind of get them, right? Because then Annihilus just destroys them, and then they have to do something else to start to put power in that location. But if your opponent commits to that location, especially with cheaper stuff like stones, so that way they don't get clogged, then you can completely flip the script with Merlin polymorphing and also with Agamotto's Images spell, turning that junk there into an actual threatening presence, and then your opponent is just boned in that location. So there is a really interesting dynamic that comes up with trying to counter Annihilus. We especially see this in the Cersei versions of Annihilus decks that do a similar thing with Sentry, but Merlin kind of also, it's a little bit on board, so your opponent might know it's coming, but Merlin has some randomness as well. Your opponent doesn't necessarily know if you're going to polymorph the Void or if you are just going to Once and Future it, I believe it's called. Yes, Once and Future is the spell here that shuffles away the card and gives you +2 energy for that. So either way, like, your opponent commits to that location, and then you all of a sudden you turn your -8 into an actual 8 power and have a real presence there, or you just turn it into 2 energy and then dip and use that energy to get more power into another location, and that can really put people on their toes when they're trying to play against this deck. And then also, it just puts a lot of power on the board. All of these cards, like I said, are on reveal cards. Hawkeye is multiple on reveal cards, and so is Merlin, and that all adds up to a lot of power there for Werewolf by Night. I will talk about this list next from Rabbit Suite, this Supergiant list, and this is also a Surge deck, once again, also a Merlin deck, though Merlin's doing something a little bit different in this one. It is trying to help you fill out your Quicksilver curve. You've got Quicksilver on turn 1, and then turn 2 you've got Merlin and Hawkeye, which those are both in the last deck, but in this deck those are just trying to fill out the curve by being a 2-cost card that then give you additional 1-cost cards, so that way you can fill and spend all of your energy and get that +2 energy here from Wiccan. Supergiant, to talk on this new inclusion to the Golden Gauntlet, does a number of things in this deck. The first thing that Supergiant does is really just disrupt your opponent's game plan, and it's hard to really quantify that as part of this deck's proactive strategy. But in the same way, like Shang-Chi is a card that we see in a lot of decks, and we just say, okay, well, Shang-Chi's part of the final play of the game. Supergiant is in a similar way, like very powerful against specific strategies. When you play against it, maybe you'll notice it depending on what you're playing, or maybe you won't notice it at all. But some examples among popular decks could include stopping a Serra from coming down on turn 5. That's like the classic Supergiant use, but also just Thanos stones. A lot of times on turn 5, we are seeing Thanos get played because Time Stone makes him a 5-cost card, but if your opponent isn't planning on doing that, if they are planning on playing specifically Space Stone, Mind Stone, or Soul Stone and getting that additional card draw, then Supergiant will throw off that curve and not allow them to get that on reveal value. Another deck that really tries to get a lot of on reveal value on turn 5 in an important way is Move Bounce. And that deck, potentially against a Supergiant, like that deck is almost always looking to bounce a bunch of their cards on turn 5 to set up for a really big turn 6. And Supergiant just makes all of those bounce cards not work at all. So Supergiant can definitely be really good there. I'm trying to think of some other key examples. But really, there's just a lot of things across the board. It stops the Legion War Machine combo, the Storm War Machine Legion combo from coming out. So it does a number of interesting things. In this deck specifically, there's 2 main things. Oh, that was the other one I was just about to bring up. Sorry, is Merlin, because we just looked at the Annihilus Merlin deck, and if your opponent is attempting to play any Merlin spell as the 3rd card in a location, with the idea being that the card will get banished and then they'll have additional space to play a 4th card there again next turn, Supergiant really stops those shenanigans from happening, because any cards that you play there aren't going to then get banished until the final turn of the game. So Supergiant against Merlin specifically can be quite good. And now this is a deck that includes Merlin, but this is not a deck that puts that many cards out onto the board. There's no stones here, there's no junk. We've got Hawkeye, Kate Bishop, but really other than that, this deck is not flooding the board in a huge way that you're really going to clog yourself with Supergiant in a detrimental way. The ways that this deck can use Supergiant proactively, the most straightforward one is going to be Maximus, allowing you to not reveal this card until beyond the final turn of the game, so your opponent isn't able to make use of those additional 2 cards, and then even more specifically, so that way those 2 additional cards contribute additional power onto Ronin. Another way that Supergiant really works in this deck that may go overlooked, but I've seen it happen a number of times, where, especially with this 7-power Supergiant, people play that on turn 4 into a location that they're losing to get priority. And if you have priority with your Supergiant play on turn 4, you're going to have priority for all of those cards that get flipped up at the end of the game, and you are going to have priority on turn 6 because your opponent's not, in most scenarios, I mean, maybe they could like move a Sam Wilson shield or something, but other than that, if you are able to have priority going into or coming out of turn 4, you're going to have it going into turn 6. And priority is super important, of course, with Alioth, but also with Negasonic Teenage Warhead, allowing that to flip over first and then destroy some of your opponent's stuff. And Shadow King, you want to not have priority with that, but you can also sneak in a Shadow King with your Super Giant play to get a little bit more value there. So that is most of, I think, what I wanted to say with this deck. Yeah, I mean, it can also surge out a Wiccan on turn 3. That's pretty sweet. Let's move along here. I don't really have a specific order. I think we're just gonna go, okay, sure. Yeah, this is another great, I think maybe I did order this one intentionally. I think for the top 16, I don't really have a specific order that I wanted to talk about them in yet. But here we have another Zavu Surge list here from Songy2266 that made the top 8 with it. But this list is probably the most straightforward list that we're going to see in this video. I wanted to at least showcase all of the top 8 decks and players, but these 12 cards in this exact configuration was a very known quantity, I would say. This is the current Surtur Scar list. With Zabu and Surge, you were able to get discounts on 3 different cards that add 10 or more power to the board, and also Enchantress, but 3 cards that you would like to play on turn 3, which is really, really powerful. And I think that this is probably the best Zabu Surge deck at just allowing you to curve out with those Zabu and Surge cards. Maybe that's not totally fair to say. Maybe the deck that got second place with Galacta and Gwenpool is a slightly better Zabu Surge deck, but this one is also quite strong. And notably, it only has 3 1-cost cards for Cole Obsidian, like the bare minimum that you could play without playing Quicksilver or Thanos, but it gets it done with Zabu, the newly buffed Sauron, and then also Zero. And speaking of buffs, I think that this deck is potentially, going to get, I don't know what you cut for it, but I think that this deck is going to get even better with the release of Nightmare. That just seems like such a cool card to include in a deck with Starbrand and Typhoid Mary and Cole Obsidian. It doesn't work with Scar. I don't think you cut Scar for Nightmare, but it does seem like that will be a really cool strategy to play into. I could be wrong, but it'll at least cause some debate over how to exactly configure this deck. Though I have seen some other builds of this. I've seen some people play Ebony Maw and some people play Lizard, and then also Crossbones sometimes instead of Cole Obsidian. But this is certainly the most straightforward list and the new current home for Surtur and Scar. Really just, yeah, the big standout here, the reason to play this, if you want like easy snap conditions, this deck I think could be a great deck to grind on the ladder with just, okay, you have the Zabu or the Surge and you don't have these 4-cost cards in your hand yet, and you're able to get some turn 1 or turn 2 snaps with a very high likelihood that you're going to have a really smooth curve. I also think that this deck is at a really interesting point in the metagame now. Shang-Chi was still the most played card in the Golden Gauntlet too. But sometimes people, especially when they're afraid of all of these Mr. Negative shenanigans, they gear a little bit more towards Enchantress. And they forget, now we saw in the finals, both finalists had both Shang-Chi and Enchantress in their deck. Sometimes that doesn't happen though. Sometimes people go a little bit more towards the I just want to play Enchantress route, and they stop playing their Shang-Chis, and then you just put a bunch of points in a lane, and you can't beat what this deck is trying to do if you don't have Shang-Chi to try to answer it. They're just going to put up way more points than you. So that, and the way that you could potentially beat those points if you don't have Shang-Chi is with something that goes crazy over the top like an Iron Man, but of course this deck is also packing its own Enchantress, which works as a way to turn off your Star Brand, Typhoid Mary, and Red Skull, and then also whatever your opponent is trying to do. Also, in the top 8 here, moving along, I think we have, is this another RSM list? It is, yes. So I just threw one more RSM list in here to talk about. This is not that different than the previous one. It includes Lady Deathstrike, which is a cool card, and again, I mean, it's another 5/7 alongside Legion here, but it is, again, just like an example of a card that, with 1 extra energy, RSM enjoys being able to play it, and other decks really can't. And I think that, I mean, by definition, RSM can really afford to play anything. I do think that I saw one other RSM player that was running the other newly buffed card. What is it? Obsidian Omega Red. Omega Red in RSM. I do believe I saw somebody playing, just because that can be a 4-cost card. Nothing else really to say here about Unity 0919's list. But yeah, they were able to get it done. Also a 34-card RSM deck. And then rounding out the top 8, we did see this player yesterday also go undefeated, I want to say, Jonathan Liu here, with Big Thanos, with Hope Summers and Surge to cheat out some even bigger cards, and then Captain Marvel and Vision as a way to move some of that power around a little bit and be a little bit unpredictable. And certainly a little bit unpredictable. I was not expecting this configuration of cards to really make it into a Thanos, but I think that it shows, just like I was kind of saying, like how good every card in Marvel Snap really is, and how close everything is to being playable, that we can have something that, sure, a lot of games this is going to play pretty similar to other Thanos decks, right? Because it still has the stones, it still has the Strange Supreme, but it also is playing a bunch of totally different cards that make it play a whole lot different. No, oh geez. Mockingbird. No Mockingbird in this list. Instead, just going for Red Hulk, going over the top. I talked about this list in my previous video, so not going to spend too much more time on it. And that's also why anyone, so I did want to include this in the video just because Jonathan did make top 8, which is impressive. Anyone that I talked about in yesterday's video that made top 16, I did not include in this one, again, just for time. But in the top 16, we do have, let's see, let's scroll down to this one first. And you'll notice all of my other decks are like more or less in order here, but this one has been in my collection with these exact 12 cards. Actually, I checked since at least January of this year. I have been playing Bullseye with Moon Girl, and I am finally vindicated to see Probka get into the top 16 with Moon Girl, Dakin, Bullseye. And I call this deck Dakin Bullseye, or Dakin Discard, because really, in my experience, especially with this Moon Girl build of the deck, is a Dakin deck list. And there's a few other cards that you can play over Moon Girl. The most common card that people play in this slot is Grandmaster, but I am here today with this video to talk about why Moon Girl is so good. I have put out some videos with this list with Moon Girl on my channel before. Like I said, you'll have to scroll back because this deck has not changed since January of this year. So you'll have to scroll back a little bit to see exactly, because I haven't covered this deck in a little bit, but I do have a bunch of, like, I won like 3 Infinity Conquest tickets with it or something. So, and I'm just like sitting on all of that footage. So at some point I might start to put out some more content with this deck. I think I've got a YouTube short that I could probably put up, I just have a bunch of other content that I'm rolling out with this week. So we are not going to probably roll out anything else today, but I just want to talk about Moon Girl for a second. So Moon Girl is really good because, in my opinion, the whole purpose of this deck is to have a Dakin in 2 locations. And then discard the Marumasa shards with either Bullseye or Modok, or sometimes some combination of like Blade and Colleen Wing. And really, the rest of this stuff is like supplemental / a backup plan. We've got Collector, Morbius, and Mike that can all gain power from you doing things that you kind of want to do already. And then Scorn and Swarm, they're cards that can get discarded for value. They can pump up your other things. But really, I think the main strategy that this deck wants to do is, so like the typical curve is Bullseye on 3, then turn 4 Dakin, turn 5 Frigga, turn 6, play another Dakin, discard both of the Marumasa shards with Bullseye, and you've got a pair of 16 power cards at 2 different locations. And 16 power, not enough to win a location, which is where the Collector and Morbius and the Swarms and other things do add into that, plus the Affliction that Bullseye gives. But I think that's the main plan that you want to be going for. And I think that Moon Girl is the, oh, did I mention Arnim Zola? I think I mentioned Arnim Zola, but Arnim Zola can also be a fun way to copy your Dakin. But I found that Moon Girl is the most consistent, and you have a lot more control over Moon Girl in this deck than you would with other decks because of Colleen Wing and Blade allowing you to discard your hand. And there's just a lot of really fun puzzles where sometimes you're like playing Scorn and Swarm on the early turns of the game. Like imagine your hand is Scorn, Swarm, Frigga, Dakin. And the order really matters because Moon Girl is going to copy your cards from left to right. Oh gosh, this is mirrored. From left to right on your screen. And you want to pay attention to that so that way you are playing or trying to discard the cards on the left side of your hand. As I'm shaking my right hand, it's a little confusing. You want to try to be playing and discarding the cards on the left side of your hand so that way Moon Girl can copy the things on the right side of your hand more easily. And that can also sometimes be accomplished by like using Blade to discard cards on the right side so that way you can copy more things with Moon Girl in case Dakin is like the second thing in your hand. So a lot of interesting strategies that you can use with that, and Moon Girl also does work with the backup plans of Collector and Swarm and Morbius, giving you multiple copies of these things that you can discard to Modok and Bullseye and then just pump up your other cards. So I think it just works out really, really well with the deck's backup plan and with the deck's main plan, which is making a bunch of Dakins. I think that Bullseye, for a little bit, was somewhat more difficult to play. So I just want to talk about like what type of tech this deck doesn't want to see. Red Guardian is a little bit of a bummer, but most people, especially when you run out a turn 2 Morbius or Collector, most people will snap up that opportunity and Red Guardian those cards. And if they don't, you can play Bullseye in the same location as your Morbius and your Collector as long as the Collector isn't growing immediately, and those cards will kind of act as a buffer for Bullseye. And I've even played Scorn before as a buffer for Bullseye. Being able to just make sure that your Bullseye gets to go off unaffected is really powerful. It has been like Lady Deathstriked on me recently too, so there are some other things that Bullseye has to watch out for, but that's mostly it. The other thing that can kind of get you is Mobius. I always get confused when I'm talking about Morbius and Mobius back and forth, but Mobius can stop you from getting free swarms to then throw out a bunch of Bullseyes. But that's not really the deck's main game plan, and Mobius does not stop the Marumasa shards. What does stop the Marumasa shards is Gorgon, but That's not typically something that this deck has to worry about. Gorgon's not that highly played, and for the most part, I think that this deck can avoid the Mobiuses, and that's also possibly why I feel like Dakin is the main game plan, just because it's a lot more difficult to disrupt. The way that you disrupt Dakin is with Affliction, because they are going to now, Red Guardian on the Dakin can be a little bit of a bummer, because then it only has 2 power, and if you try to frigate it after they Red Guardian it, then of course that doesn't work. But otherwise, stuff like Cassandra Nova or Scorpion, those can be like a little bit awkward, but typically aren't that big of a deal. Actually, in the mirror matchup, Bullseye is really good, and sometimes you want to activate Bullseye early so that way you can shrink their Dakin, and then they're forced to go with the Swarm backup plan, which is a lot less power. But that's a bunch of words on a very specific deck, but I do think that just the fact that this deck, oh, I'm sorry, it did get one change. MODOK lost a point of power since like January or February, but other than that, really has not taken a hit at all. And that 1 point from MODOK, I will have to look at that if I post any of my old Bullseye footage, but I think for the most part, it doesn't really affect the deck too much, to be super honest. The next deck in the top 16 is actually, I think, one that we looked at yesterday. Okay, yeah, I did cover this deck yesterday, so I don't have too much more to say about it. Go check out yesterday's video for this and other sweet undefeated decks from day 1 of the tournament. This Thanos deck is actually where I wanted to make the point, though, that you can actually do whatever you want to do in Marvel Snap. We've got Luna Snow and Cersei in this Thanos list, which is definitely a spicy inclusion. Cersei allows you to turn all of your stones in that location into 2-cost cards, which gives them significantly more power. I'd say for 2-cost cards are probably going to have about 3 power, whereas you're trying to target the stones that have like 1 power each. They will still be strange food, so that is an interesting thing to consider. And then we do have a lot more tech in this version. On top of that, we've got the Red Guardian, Shang-Chi and Enchantress both, Mobius, and Shadow King. So the full suite of tech options here, but also like a few more ways to go over the top, really, with Luna Snow and Cersei providing both ramp and power from Luna Snow. Those 6 points are definitely nothing to scoff at. And then, yeah, it's also strange food and Mockingbird discount, so that's fun. And then Cersei just being a card that really honestly doesn't see as much play as it could. It's a really cool card. I'm a big fan of it just because of the RNG that it introduces into Marvel Snap, which I am a big fan of. And yeah, that's really all I have to say. This is where I really wanted to make the point that you can do whatever the heck you want in Marvel Snap and get away with it, because every card is still pretty good. I mean, there's some clunkers to be sure, but there's definitely some room to experiment with still. Also in the top 16, we have Kingpin, who is a friend of the channel. Kingpin won my Marvel Snap Golden Gauntlet qualifier for the first Golden Gauntlet, and I invited them to that event because of it. And we're also going to be doing like a partnership series. I'm trying to think of like the best way. We're entering a duos tournament together. Kingpin is going to be my partner in that, so it was super cool to see Kingpin get a top 16. I was already excited for him to make day 2 of this event, but they are a huge fan of Move Bounce. You've seen them on the channel before play Move Bounce. They played it to win my tournament. They also played it in my video that I uploaded Saturday, sort of testing that I did with Scream Machine. I had a really epic match with them. Really go check that out. It was a ton of fun. I don't want to spoil it, but No, yeah, I'll say this. The match goes to 10 rounds. A single conquest match made it to round 10, and they are a really good Marvel Snap player, and it was a lot of fun to play against them, and yeah, just huge props to see them make it to this point in the event. So they decided to cut Doctor Strange from Move Bounce to play Toxin, Falcon, and Beast, the trifecta of bounce cards here. They did let me know that that was a change that they made because of Mercury. They just wanted to have a little bit less reliance on the move cards, and being able to bounce your cards just gives you a little bit more flexibility into that specifically. So that is why we see the full suite here of Toxin, Falcon, and Beast. And also, Kingpin has provided us here with the final screenshots from every game in their match up against Roram in the top 16, who eventually went on to win the event. So hopefully that makes you feel a little bit better when the person that beats you ultimately winds up winning the tournament. This game here was really close. Looks like Agamotto got imaged over here in Murder World, but Kingpin actually, I think, has more total power on the board. It's pretty close, but they're losing by 8 and then, or I'm sorry, winning by 8 and then losing by 2 and 4. Yeah, so more total power by just a little bit, but some really tight contested locations here, and then Sage was friggin'. If we move on to the second clip here, oh yeah, this one they told me about. This was the Nexus game where they said Aranya made things a little bit awkward because Aranya brought something to the right, and that makes it difficult to try to win a leftmost the Nexus. They did have a few points that they could have dropped on the final turn with Vulture plus Sage, probably for like 34. Could have actually been good. You never know if your opponent has Alioth, like Alioth, and then your Werewolf jumps over is a pretty solid final play that definitely wins. So it's tough to stay into that one, especially it looks like Roran boomer snapped on the final turn here. What do we have for game 3? We've got a Nidavellir Legion game that Kingpin was able to take back. Yeah, Nidavellir, I don't know, Nidavellir can kind of go either way, especially with the Thanos stones, but no stones to be had here. One was maybe blinked and one was Hulkbuster. Actually, this Hulkbuster's on nothing because this is an 8-power Hulkbuster. So, yeah, just not that impressive here for Roram, and Kingpin was able to get this one. Next up is game 5, which we can't really see. I'm not going to try to make too much sense out of this one. Let's just jump to the next one here. Oh, this was the one that they brought up and said was super exciting. So Daily Bugle gave them Legion, which they then used. This location was Monster Metropolis, which was giving Agamotto +3 power here. And because, yeah, this wasn't a Legion into Miniaturized Lab that like did anything interesting. It was simply a Legion into Mini Lab on the final turn to turn off a Monster Metropolis and swing that location back in Kingpin's favor. And then I think we've got one more screenshot here from the final game. This one, Project Pegasus and Feast, which just all that extra energy allowed Roram to go super over the top. This looks like, no, this is actually just an RSM card because Roram is not running Iron Patriot, right? So yeah, this is just an Orca that then got imaged, and they were able to get a bunch of points here in the most contested location, just go crazy over the top with 33 powers worth of Orca to win the match. Thank you very much to Kingpin for providing us with that, and hopefully Kingpin will provide us with some more entertainment in the future. Came up with a sweet team name for us as well. No Luck King Way will be our team name. So yeah, we'll see how that goes in that duos tournament in the future. Looks like I've got 3 more decks to round out the top 16. And then I also wanted to take a look at 3 more decks that were almost in the top 16, but lost out on tiebreakers, and I still thought were pretty interesting lists. This is stock Cerebro 2. Nothing super crazy about it. Goose and Storm as Lockout. Also Echo as a little bit of Lockout. Cerebro, Mystique, and then Mr. Sinister and Brood and Lasher to all get more value out of those, with Nico and Storm also allowing you to have a little bit of location manipulation, and Luke Cage to allow you to not care about affliction locations. Pretty straightforward stuff here. Good job, iThomas, for getting into the top 16 with Cerebro. Honestly, I'm a huge Cerebro fan. I should be playing this right now while Cerebro is super great. And yeah, just good and a lot of fun. This is, I think, the reason that some people were moving back to Enchantress again, and why I thought Enchantress could potentially be a little bit more popular in this tournament, though I did play ongoing Thanos, so I was kind of hoping that Enchantress would not be too big of a factor, and I mean, it was reasonably a factor. This is not an Enchantress deck. This is a Red Guardian deck. This is Silk Scream with a fairly straightforward, no nonsense, no like War Machine Legion lockout shenanigans. Just Scream, Craven, and a card to move your opponent's card every turn. One thing that I think is kind of interesting is like seeing a Cannonball deck that doesn't run Mercury now, but of course this deck actually wants to move the card with Cannonball, and Mercury is just like a total nombo with Scream and Craven and your other cards, though I do wonder if there is still some potential to do something with that. And specifically, there are a few combos here still with Mercury. One, Mercury, you can move it once. So you can move it into your Craven location. You can also use it to not move a card with Arrow. Sometimes that's awkward. Sometimes you want to play a 5/9 and you don't want to move the last card that your opponent played into that same location. You just want to put 9 points of power down. So yeah, Mercury could be kind of an interesting thing to see play along with that, and it could also give you a discount on Miles Morales. It's probably too much anti-synergy with the rest of the stuff that the deck is doing, but yeah, just funny now to see Cannonball without its new friend Mercury. Rounding out the top 16, we do have a Cannonball Mercury list, and also a Supergiant list. I did not realize that we were going to have one more Supergiant list, and honestly, I have not spent that much time unpacking this list, but it's cool. It's a Fenris Wolf list with Negasonic, Killmonger, Gladiator, and Cannonball. So 4 different ways to potentially destroy a card so that you can use it with Fenris Wolf. And then it is also playing Cosmo to stop your opponent from doing different shenanigans. Sage as just like, okay, this is a 3/8 that I want to be able to play on the final turn. This is so much the opposite of what we have seen so much of recently, which is Zabu decks that play a bunch of 4s. This is just a deck that plays a bunch of 3s and is trying to play 2 different 3s on the final turn of the game. On turn 5, you are really hoping to play this Claw or Cannonball in a way that, like, face down can be very difficult for your opponent to predict exactly what you're trying to do. Also, there is a cool synergy with Supergiant and Cannonball in that if you don't have the Mercury yet, turn 4 Supergiant, turn 5 Cannonball, turn 6 play the Mercury into the Cannonball location, and then that will still flip up before the Mercury does. So that can get some nice extra value there too. And then you can activate the Fenris Wolf that you play. No, you can't. You can't activate Fenris Wolf if you're destroying something with Cannonball, because Cannonball will reveal after the Fenris Wolf. So that is one thing that you do have to watch out for. This deck has a lot of other synergies, and then it's also a Daredevil deck. Daredevil, Supergiant, and those make for a really interesting combination. That was the thumbnail of the video that I put out yesterday, one of my favorite matches in the Golden Gauntlet 2, I played against a deck with Daredevil and Supergiant, and I was able to predict what they were doing in a really satisfying way. So definitely go check out that video. That was, just some sweet highlights of two of my favorite matches from the day one portion of this event. Cool deck. I don't really know if I have much else to say. They're just trying to play, like, pound for pound a bunch of the best cards, and Supergiant and Claw are kind of in those same camps in some way. Just getting to play a 4/7 is a lot of power. Remember when Wiccan was a 4/7 for no reason? That was wild. Claw it was nerfed. I just opened it up here in the other screen, but now it gives 7 power, so it's still a 5/11, still a pretty good rate. And Daredevil just allows you to, I think one thing that Daredevil does that's kind of cool, similar to Supergiant, when you have both of them, it doesn't do this in any effective way, but Daredevil also allows you to either gain or toss priority going into the final turn in an important way for a deck that is playing Negasonic and Cannonball. And just like having that full information to know whether or not you're going to be able to get priority with like a pretty good degree of confidence, I will say, because there are things like Merlin's Polymorph or Cersei that you get to play as kind of like face down, face up cards. In a pretty, I can't remember if I included this in the video yesterday or not. I think I did, but there was also a game against Daredevil where I played something. So one of the locations was Great Web, and that just like leaving a little bit of ambiguity on the board, my opponent not knowing what card from either of us was going to get pulled into the Great Web. I left the third spot in Great Web open, and the other locations were like interesting, like locations that were already getting locked down. Let's say it was like Mini Lab and Kiln, or I think it was Mini Lab and Vault specifically. Let's say it was that. And I played a card to the Vault, so they played 2 cards into Great Web, one of which was Negasonic Teenage Warhead, and then the card that I played in the Vault moved into the Great Web, which means I dodged the Negasonic Teenage Warhead, and then that location was filled, so it didn't even have any use for the final turn of the game. So that was like a really satisfying, kind of unintentional play around Daredevil, but one that I thought was really fun and kind of also still just speaks to the synergy between Daredevil and Negasonic Teenage Warhead regardless. Now we are going to move into decks that I'm just calling top 32 decks. These decks might have been in like the 30 to 40 range, somewhere in there. But the point is, these players, despite being a little bit higher up on the ranking, were also 8-2. So all of these players with potential different breakers or something could have made it into the top 16 in a different universe. Things just did not slice their way. And the first one that I wanted to look at here is a Nimrod deck that also has Galactus at the top of the curve, which I think is fun. So this is also a Zabu Surge deck, and the top of their, or the Zabu Surge cards that they are angling for are Galacta. We know that one's powerful. Iron Lad, which can be so many different things that it is hard to exactly quantify it. And then also Symbiote Spider-Man, which isn't doing that much when it's played on turn 3, but it's still a 3/7 and can still put a lot of pressure on your opponent. So notably, this deck has a bunch of cards. Well, any cards that pump up your power are really good with Nimrod, and they're really good with Galactus. So we're just playing a bunch of cards that do that. Surge, Galacta, Phastos, and then Symbiote Spider-Man. Not really Iron Lad, other than the fact that Iron Lad can be any of these other cards and it's a combo deck or whatever. Penny Parker, also doing some interesting, so Surge, Fastos, and Penny Parker all do kind of double or triple duty here because they can pump up your Nimrod, but they also give you energy in the form of Penny Parker, or cheap deductions, I'll say, in the form of Fastos and Surge, to allow you to play these cards a little bit earlier. I just thought this was a really interesting look. Typically, we don't see Galactus in these decks, but also typically we don't really see like Surge and Fastos as just like smaller ways to pump up Nimrod, but that are also really nicely synergistic with Galactus. So I'm curious to see how this evolves. Normally we also see Deathlock in these decks, so that omission is a little bit strange, and I would maybe like to play that over Penny Parker personally, or potentially even over Zabu, but I appreciate somebody trying something new, and despite all of these being like pretty respectable Marvel Snap cards, I have not really seen them in this exact configuration, so that is something that I would potentially be looking to try in the future. And this deck, I think, is not something super crazy to write home about, but also it kind of is. So there is some really cool stuff going on in this deck. Namely, I really just wanted to draw attention to one thing, which is that Merlin could be a cute Silver Surfer card, because turn 2 you can play it, turn 3 you play a 3-cost card, turn 4 you play a 3-cost card, and you polymorph your Merlin into a different 3-cost card. And just that interaction alone, I think, is a cheeky way to get another 3-cost card on the board in Silver Surfer that I think is potentially worth exploring. So Merlin in Silver Surfer, just wanted to give a shout out to Lemming. I'm sure they're not the only person doing this. New 2-cost season pass card, put it in your Silver Surfer deck. Silver Surfer has evolved really interesting over the years, that like some Silver Surfer decks even play Zabu, because Galacta and Gwenpool are just so good with the other cards that synergize with getting that Silver Surfer buff. But I thought that Merlin, oh yeah, and like 2-cost cards are also really good in the deck just because they work out so well on the curve, right? But yeah, I just thought that Merlin would be an interesting look. Probably on turn 4, just playing one of these 2 cards is going to be better most of the time, but it is interesting just to at least consider Merlin's impact on the deck. And then finally, to round out this video, we have, maybe we'll call this deck Mr. Positive. This is negativeless negative. And yeah, 2 negatives make a positive here. This is a deck that, on first glance, looks like a Mr. Negative deck. It is actually a Pixie deck, so there is still some funking with the cost on your cards, but it is also a Bast and Agent Venom deck, and is really just trying to take it in another direction that doesn't get hosed by Mobius, but still gets to go over the top with some huge haymakers in the form of Iron Man and Gore and Mystique that your opponents just might not be equipped to deal with, especially when a lot of players are counting on Mobius specifically to deal with these high power outputs. I thought this list was a really, really interesting take on that, and even gets to play Mobius itself, and you could potentially fit in some other tech cards as you see fit. And then the Hood, Bast, and Nico are kind of doing like double duty here, because they're also allowing you to change costs with Pixie and do some nice stuff with that. But I just thought that Bast plus Iron Man and Sage and all of these just big cards, without really looking to play like Thena or anything, really this deck is trying to go over the top, I thought was a neat look. And that was the other thing I was going to say. Gore is kind of like an underrated part of the metagame, with Thanos running everywhere, and also the second place deck, no, I'm sorry, it was a top 4 deck from Honifer, the a Nihilist deck. I talked about how that was all the Werewolf by Night decks that are also all on reveal. Gore just gets to get really big against decks full of on reveal cards, and then this deck also has a decent amount of on reveal cards itself. I just thought there was also at least one Mr. Negative deck in like the top 32, as we're calling it here. So I don't want to say that like that didn't exist, but I wanted to shine a special highlight on these three players in the top 32 that I thought were doing something unique. But for today, that is going to be it for me. Thank you guys very much for watching. This is a long one. Let me know what you thought about it and if you want to see more content like this. But for today, that's going to be it for me. Thank you guys very much for watching. I'm NoLucksGiven. Peace.